welcome. My name is Phil Glendenning. I'm the director of the Edmund Rice Centre, and I'd like to welcome you all to this launch of our Settlement Cities report, place-based study of Australia's major refugee settlement destinations. But I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country that we gather on in different parts of Australia. States of South Australia, Victoria, Queensland and New South Wales as they're known now, but Aboriginal land as it has been known for the 65,000 years. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land, and we acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. So welcome one and all. This is a big project that has been expertly managed by Alton Gavranovic, who's done a magnificent job. And I want to say that from the get-go, Alton, to thank you for this. You stepped in halfway through the process when the esteemed Farhad Aryan was unable to continue it. And so on behalf of the Centre, Alton, I'll say it again before the end, but thank you very much for the job that you have done. Now, folks, just in terms of housekeeping for this afternoon's launch, we're sticking to a 60-minute timetable, and there will be time for questions that are typed into the chat. Because we've got so many people coming on this afternoon, handling the taking those questions by hands up would be a bit logistically impossible. So if you've got a question or a comment to make, we'd like you to put that in the chat, particularly to Alton and to Aya Abu Bashir, who is representing the co-authors of this report this afternoon. Just in terms of housekeeping, again, this is a normal Zoom event. So what that means is it's important that you mute yourself and make sure your microphone is on mute. And we'll take the questions, as I said, and just type them into the chat. In terms of the process, Alton and Aya are going to take us through the presentation of the report. That'll be about 15 to 20 minutes. And then after that, at around 4:25 or so, we'll take some questions or comments that people have got and ask our speakers to respond. And then we're very privileged at the end, just before we finish at about 1:45, to have Basha Hana, who is well known to most people in Australia who've had anything to do with the refugee or multicultural communities. And we're very grateful that Basha, that you're going to be here to speak to us this afternoon again, comrade. So without any further ado, again, I'd say welcome. This report involves some 18 organisations, 7 local government area councils, over 150 participants in 4 states of Australia. It was a big undertaking, and so again, congratulations to the team, who I'll go through at the end. But now, without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Alton Gavranovic and Aya Abu Bashir for the formal presentation of the report. So over to you, Alton and Aya.
Thanks very much, Phil, and thank you all for being here. So the way we're going to do this is Aya is going to lead us in with just a quick overview of what the research project was about and the report itself, and then I'll follow up with a brief discussion of our recommendations and findings. Findings and recommendations, rather. Okay, so over to you, Aya.
Thank you, Alton. Thank you, Phil, and thank you everyone for being here with us today. I have 5 minutes, so I will limit it to 5 points that I will mainly talk about. The first one is what the report is about in general terms, then the settlement cities that we tackled, and then why did we choose these 7 LGAs. And then I will talk to you about the methodology that we adopted. And lastly, I will summarize the themes before Alton discuss them in more details. So the first one is what the report is about. This Settlement Cities report looks at refugees settlement in Australia through a more place-based lens. It's to our knowledge that this is the first detailed investigation of refugee settlement through the lens of Australia's major settlement cities. We believe that like a major theme that runs throughout this report is the importance of community to the settlement journey. Refugees are increasingly drawn to Australia's major settlement cities by the presence of ethno-linguistic communities that are formed by earlier waves of arrivals. The research on which this report is based was carried out in partnership with a variety of local stakeholders, including the council of each LGA, major settlement service providers, and refugee community groups active in each LGA, as well as peak settlement bodies and the Australian Catholic University. Now, as Phil mentioned, we focused on 7 LGAs. These are the settlement cities that this report tackles or discusses. These are, first one is Fairfield and Liverpool in Sydney's southeast, Hume, Greater Dandenong and Casey in Melbourne's northwest and southeast, Logan, which covers the area between Brisbane City and the Gold Coast, and lastly, Salisbury in Adelaide's north. Now, there is a question, why did we choose to focus only on those 7 LGAs? And to put it in simple terms, because most refugees actually settle there. So these are the top 7 destinations for humanitarian arrivals in Australia over the past decade. Now, how did we do this research? So talking about the methodology, this research is based on qualitative interviews and focus groups. So we conducted 62 one-hour interviews and 9 two-hour focus groups across the 7 LGAs. The interviews and the vast majority of the focus groups were conducted via Zoom, and this happened from October 2021 through February 2022. In the case of many LGAs, this was actually towards the end of 2 long years of COVID lockdowns. Talking about the participants, the average number of participants in the focus groups was around 12. And in these focus groups, mainly we focused on having 3 groups that we interviewed and we invited to participate in the focus groups. Those are the recently arrived refugees and refugee community leaders and local service providers who have pertinent settlement experience and expertise. So in all, more than 150 people actually participated in this study. This number drawn more or less equally from the 7 LGAs. Now, talking about the themes, this report is structured around 4 broad themes of refugees' experience of place and belonging. The first broad theme is refugees' aspirations and experiences of settlement. And we discussed this theme in chapter 3. Mainly, we asked people about their experiences of the major challenges and achievements of the settlement in each of the LGAs. Now, the second theme is making home in the settlement city. And we discussed this theme in chapter 4. And it's mainly focused on what it meant for refugees to settle well and to make a home for themselves in the settlement city. The third theme is creating community, and it discussed in more details in chapter 5, and it focuses on where did refugees find community and belonging, where and how. The last theme is accessing formal support, and this one is covered in chapter 6, and it focuses on how well refugees were able to access essential services. Now, for more details and discussion on these four themes, I will hand it over to Alton to discuss our findings and recommendations.
Thanks very much, Aya. Yeah, look, so as I said to you, I'm going to be talking about the findings and recommendations, and I'll be following those four themes, since that is, after all, what we were asking people about. So taking this first theme of refugee aspirations and achievements and challenges around settlement, really to summarize it, to sort of, if you kind of want to define a main aspiration that keeps coming up in these interviews and focus groups, it's the refugees come here with a strong desire to rebuild their lives, right? To recoup some of what they've lost in the process of kind of being displaced, and to establish a secure foundation for themselves and their families going into the future. And practically what that means for them, what most people talked about, are two things, right? Well, the first is employment, right? A job, having a job that makes sense for that particular person. And what that really means is a stable job, a reasonably remunerated one, and one that importantly draws on their past skills, interests, and qualifications, if possible. The other thing that's really important to that sense of establishing a secure foundation in the new country for a lot of people is stable housing tenure. And for many people in Australia, that really means home ownership, right? Though some people also talked about things like public housing. But so these two things, stable, good employment and stable housing are often a challenge, right? So when people were able to achieve them, they talked about that with a great deal of satisfaction, but many more people probably talked about it as things that were proving a bit elusive. And that's not a new finding at all, right? So many previous reports about settlement in Australia have identified those two things as major challenges for refugees. There is a local dimension, a place-based dimension to this that I think our report contributes. One is that unemployment is actually relatively high in the settlement cities that we studied. And what that really means is that there's not necessarily all that many jobs available locally. And that really can be a problem for refugees, especially early on, because their mobility, their ability to move around the city in search of employment is not necessarily equal to that of other Australians. They may not know how to drive. They almost certainly don't own a car when they first get here. And navigating public transport is, of course, also complicated. So that kind of dearth of local jobs can prove an issue to some people. The other aspect of this, housing, is actually quite interesting, and it's a novel finding of this report, which is that housing is not necessarily that cheap in the settlement cities, right? So the cost of housing very closely matches the median cost of housing in that state, right? So obviously, housing is more expensive in Sydney than in Adelaide, but those LGAs match their state averages fairly well. But here's where it's kind of interesting is those settlement cities, income in those cities is below the median, right? So housing is more expensive relative to people's income, right? Their incomes are below the median, but their housing costs are about at the median. So you can see this puts housing stress on people. And one of the things this actually tells us is that, housing is not cheap, because these are actually quite desirable places to live for people from multicultural communities. And I'll go into why that is in a moment. People had, of course, many other kinds of aspirations other than employment and housing. Those are just the two that kind of dominate the data. So I won't talk about those now because I have a very limited amount of time, but I will put it out there in case people want to follow it up with questions. Education and educational opportunities were another major aspiration. Family reunion and giving back to the community, contributing to the Australian community. These were all other major kind of themes. So if you want to know about any of those in more details, please ask us about it in the Q&A. Moving on now to that second theme. The second theme really was about how refugees feel about the places where they now live and whether they feel at home there. And in talking about the places they live, about the settlement cities, refugees were actually overwhelmingly very positive. And again, overwhelmingly, the reason for this was that they identified when we asked them why they felt good about the places they lived, was the presence of these really vibrant ethnic communities that they could kind of step into almost as soon as they arrived in Australia. On the ground, right, the presence of these earlier waves of migration that were from similar parts of the world or similar ethnic backgrounds meant that many people in the settlement cities speak their native language. So it's easier to make themselves understood when they first arrive, even if they don't know English. They have easy access to ethnically familiar foods and commodity items, but also cultural and social opportunities. And all of this really makes settlement much easier and quicker, makes it much easier to kind of feel at home and lessens that culture shock of coming to Australia, because at least there is a little sort of pocket of familiarity or pockets of familiarity in an otherwise new place. The other way in which these ethnic communities are really important is that they actually provide a great deal of settlement support, right? So they're an important complement to formal settlement services that are delivered, that are funded by the government, in the sense that they kind of do all the little things that people need when they first get here and in an ongoing way, right? So community networks and associations help people access services. They might take them to the doctor, help them kind of with interpretation, help them identify, how to catch a bus, or even help them look for work, right? So, so the sort of the presence of the ethnic community really kind of holds people, and that's really important in those, especially in those early months and years when things are still really hard and really foreign. On the negative side about what people sort of didn't like about their areas or what they found challenging, there was a frequent comment that the settlement city is a bit lacking in sufficient community infrastructure to support this vibrant ethnic community life, right? So meeting venues and meeting halls and community halls are scarce and can be expensive. Sporting fields and parks similarly can be difficult to access. So there's sometimes a sense that sort of vibrant community life is sometimes being held back a little bit by the fact that the physical infrastructure just isn't kind of keeping up with people's needs. Okay, moving on now to that third theme about where refugees find community and belonging. As I've already anticipated, obviously, initially, when refugees first come to the country, those ethnically and linguistically familiar social spaces are really, really crucial. And so what we mean by that is that there is, the settlement city is full of, religious and ethnic and national and linguistic associations that, organize a variety of social events, like, weddings and funerals in case of churches, but also celebrations and sporting opportunities and just opportunities for conviviality, which can really help refugees kind of enter into that community and build a more informal set of networks, and expand their social network. And so that in the early days is really a major source of community and belonging. And we noticed that in the few instances where we talked to someone who didn't have that kind of vibrant ethnic community nearby, they could end up feeling quite isolated. But isolation was not the common experience. It was instead this kind of very warmly embraced sort of experience of being held by this community. Now, engaging with the wider Australian community can actually be quite hard initially for many refugees. Obviously, there are language barriers. Many people come speaking very little English. There are also cultural barriers. People socialize quite differently in Australia to what people might be used to coming from other countries. Refugees also talked about a lack of opportunity, right? So particularly people who didn't have a workplace, who were not employed. Obviously work is an enormously important place of social connection in Australia, and so if you're locked out of that, then that can make meeting new people quite difficult. And sometimes people, of course, talked about outright discrimination, which are kind of experiences which, though isolated, had kind of put them off or made them wary about engaging with people outside of their ethnic community. But overall, the interest in engaging beyond that community was very high. Most people expressed a desire to do that. And speaking to refugees who'd been in the country for longer, it became clear that over a longer time frame, actually, as some of these barriers lessen and people find ways to overcome them, social engagements do tend to widen. That's particularly true if you think about it intergenerationally, right? So kids go to school with lots of kids from different backgrounds, and then the parents meet people from different cultures through the kids, stuff like that. The final theme that that we asked refugees about and other interviewees and participants was access to services. You know, are refugees able to access services equitably and on the same terms as other Australians? And here the picture is really complicated and really uneven, right? So some services, especially services that are sort of oriented towards settlement, that are specifically funded to work with refugees, because these settlement areas have been settlement areas often for decades, and because these services have had, you know, thousands and thousands of refugees they've helped, they've developed a lot of expertise in terms of how to help people and be accessible. Other services are more difficult to access, and so particularly services that are targeted to mainstream Australia, so that aren't specifically to refugees, they're all over the place. Some of them are very good, and some of them are quite difficult to access. One sort of set of services that sort of is particularly difficult is what used to be called the Job Active system. That's now been renamed Workforce Australia. I beg your pardon. They tend to be particularly difficult for refugees to access, and that was a recurring theme of complaint. In terms of the kind of barriers that makes access difficult for refugees, there are of course physical accessibility barriers. So as I said, refugees often have difficulties with getting around. So if services are located really far away or far away from public transport, that makes things really, really hard in terms of accessing them. There is also barriers of digital access, right? So many services these days are accessed through the internet, and that assumes all kinds of things like you are a comfortable digital user, you can afford digital technology, you have a stable internet connection. All of these things may not be true for refugees, and that makes accessing services digitally really hard. And finally, there's issues of cultural accessibility, right? So whether the people who are working at the service are culturally competent and can help you navigate the service if you're really unfamiliar with Australia and how things work here. And that's, again, very hit and miss. So in terms of what helps people access services and overcome these barriers, employing bicultural workers was a really big one. So services that made sure that their workforce reflected the community and the kind of clients that were going to access the service ethnically, they tended to do better because bicultural workers could help with some of that stuff around cultural competence, right? They could translate a bit what needed to happen if somebody was unfamiliar. Another important strategy are service hubs, right? So where services are co-located in areas that are close to where refugees live, that makes those issues of physical access much easier to navigate. Finally, there were outreach programs, right? Programs where services don't just wait for refugees to come to them, but actually go to the refugee community and sort of explain how to access the service and how things work. So again, that kind of helps navigate those kind of cultural divides that makes accessing services harder. Finally, one big sort of contribution to services working well is actually collaboration with ethnic community associations. And we saw that really powerfully during COVID. And we did this research during COVID. So people talked about this a lot, where during COVID, the public health rollout was simply not reaching these communities for a really long time. And then public health, service providers started engaging with community associations to help promote vaccination and things like that. And so some of these settlement cities went from being some of the least vaccinated LGAs in the country to the most vaccinated, really sometimes in a matter of weeks and months. It was really a very impressive example of how collaboration with ethnic community associations can make services more effective. Which then sort of takes me to our recommendations and wraps up our findings. We made a lot of recommendations, but quite a lot of them are technical. So I'm going to just stick to two main ones that I think are more suitable to a broader kind of forum like this. Our first recommendation, and it won't surprise you because I've been talking about it this entire time, is more and better support for ethnic community associations. Because community associations are amazingly powerful and important, but at the moment, they're almost entirely reliant on voluntarism, and that really limits their capacity because people only have so much free time to give. So what we need are really dedicated funding streams to support these kinds of organizations. And ideally also some assistance for them in terms of applying for and managing that funding. And that could well be provided, for instance, by the settlement service sector, which sort of tends to collaborate with them, at least intermittently, at the moment. Ethnic community associations also really need to be engaged with more meaningfully by the settlement sector and by settlement services and by all levels of government. But that's not really possible without their capacity being expanded first, right? So first we need to sort of fund them a little better so that when they get invited to participate more meaningfully in those conversations about settlement, they actually have the capacity to do that, to come to those meetings and to action those items. The final recommendation I want to talk about is we need a more consistent approach to inclusive service provision, right? Because it's just not acceptable that refugees have this sort of hit and miss experience when they're accessing services, because we're talking about things like going to the doctor and sending your kids to school, right? These are essential services that we take for granted being able to access, and people shouldn't be struggling with those. They should have an expectation that, you know, those kinds of services will actually, you know, make themselves accessible to them. And there are a number of ways of doing that. As I said earlier, one easy thing that services can do is more consistently employ bicultural workers drawn from those local communities. And we do know, you know, like it's easy to find out which kinds of communities are represented in an LGA, what kind of languages are spoken there. So you know, it's not hard for services to know what their client base looks like and what kinds of you know, bicultural workers they need to be targeting. Another thing, bicultural workers are not a silver bullet. They don't fix things by themselves. Another thing that's really important to do in terms of making services more consistently inclusive is for those mainstream services to start engaging more deeply with settlement service providers to benefit from those settlement service providers' experience with this. Because a lot of what settlement service providers do on a day-to-day basis, the bulk of their individual casework with refugees is actually troubleshooting issues with other services. So a refugee will come in with a letter from the dentist and say, I got this letter, I don't know what it means, or I've been cut off by Centrelink, can you help me sort it out? And then they get on the blower and, you know, try and figure something out. But of course, you know, rather than just doing that one-on-one with refugees on a case-by-case basis, they could be talking to these mainstream service providers and actually trying to go, hey, there's this consistent problem that crops up. Can you change your practices so this doesn't sort of keep causing problems? So we'd like to see more of those kinds of conversations at the local level happen. We also really need a greater commitment from state and federal governments to consistent standards, frankly, for cultural competency, accessibility, and equitable outcomes for multicultural communities. You know, governments at all levels have articulated that this is something that they want to happen, but they've often not been serious about making sure it happens, and even monitoring outcomes for these kinds of communities is not by any means universal. So we need to start paying more attention to what's going on when people try and access these services, and make sure those services are well supported to improve those outcomes when they're lagging. Okay, well, look, I've gone over my time a little bit, so I apologize about that. I hope I haven't bored you. I'll bring that to a close. That's a very brief summary of a very long report. So I'll turn over to Phil now, and perhaps we can have some questions to fill out the what me and Aya have talked about.
Well, thank you, Alton, and thank you, Aya, for both of your presentations there. Just a reminder to people that you need to keep yourself muted, given that we've got so many people online. There's just to kick off, there's a few questions there, Alton and Aya, and I guess the first one I'll pick up goes to the question of funding, and it is how and by who would the ethnic organisations be funded by? Asked John Baraho.
Well, look, so I think that given that the federal government does a bulk of this stuff, of the settlement service budget, I think that really the onus is on them to take a serious look at this stuff. There is, I should mention, already some funding that is allocated for this purpose. It's just quite inefficient. So there are these community capacity building programs, but the problem with them is that they kind of just, they offer training mostly to community organizations. And so they basically say, please invest even more of your time in doing these programs with us. So they don't really equip them with the capacity to do that. They don't pay them to do it effectively. So we need to really think about, you know, it is partly who's providing this. And so I think the federal government has traditionally been an important source of funding. And I think it's to them that that recommendation is directed in the report. State governments do pitch in money sometimes for this kind of stuff. The Victorian government has done it in the past, I know. And so we could also look there. But I think those two levels of government are really the ones that needs to step up, because it's not, community associations are small. They don't need a lot of money. They don't need a lot of support in this way, material support, but they do need more than they're getting. And we need to kind of keep saying that.
Okay, Aya, you got anything you want to add?
No, actually, I was about to say the same thing. Usually funding comes from the government, and usually the recommendations of our report and also previous reports that, as Alton mentioned, this is insufficient. So this is why we have been trying to really go beyond the funding issues in the report and try to think of more kind of sustainable, more practical solutions to the issue.
Okay, thanks for that. Ghassan asks a long question, which I'll try and shorten, which he talks about what many of us would believe are the unfair and illogical barriers and obstacles that refugees face in terms of their accreditation and recognition of their previous overseas work experiences, their degrees and qualifications. That basically there's a serious block in the system. I think you went to in the response to say this is in the report. Perhaps you could elaborate a bit on that particular issue and what you unearthed. Alton, either way.
I said that this one is this is more raised, like the barriers that Ghassan mentioned are more discussed in the recommendations, because we do talk about the decision makers and how politicians and the government are not actually putting more funding into reality, or more actually practical solutions into reality. Like, for example, with the service provisions, many refugees talked about how they, as soon as they arrive to Australia, all of these service providers keep calling them separately, asking for sometimes or most of the times for the same kind of questions and details about their personal lives. So, for example, one of the recommendations is to actually have coordination between those service providers. So, yes, again, maybe Alton, you want to add something to this?
Yeah, sure. So in response to the specific question about qualification recognitions, yeah, look, this is a massive issue, and it's actually it's one that most of the kind of, especially people who are from professional backgrounds, spoke about quite a lot. I mean, it's one of those hard things because it's a very distributed problem in Australia. So each profession kind of really runs its own accreditation programs. Often that's not done in good faith in some ways, right? So that they kind of will sort of try and limit the numbers of people practicing the profession rather than helping people get into it. So in our previous report, we did talk about this in more detail, about some solutions that could be kind of, tried with this stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's a good point. It's a major issue that complicates that whole employment situation. And if people can't find employment that feels like the right employment for them, as I said in my talk, that's a major barrier to them settling and feeling that they're secure in Australia. Yeah.
Yes, and maybe I can add to this point for the academic certification and work experiences, that in the report we tried to really separate between those who come to Australia at a younger age and those who comes at a much older age. So we say that it is very difficult, obviously, for those who are older and above 50. Many of the refugees that we spoke to, especially from Iraq, they were chemists and they were engineers in their own countries for more than 20 years. But then, of course, when they come here, they are asked for accreditations and qualifications, and even when they go actually and they take this accreditation, it is still not recognized because they believe that there is also this this age barrier that is still there in the employment sector.
Right, and of course that all comes at a cost too, doesn't it? That is often difficult for people to raise the funds. Now, is this a question about the LGA participation, and how much does local government area participation in the intercultural cities or welcoming cities framework make a difference in local policy to assist new arrivals? Alton?
Well, I mean, look, I kind of think this is one of the things that really impressed me. And so we go into some detail about this, about the work of councils in the report is these councils, and I don't know whether it's because they're participating in the welcoming cities thing or because these LGAs are just so diverse that it's sort of impossible for councils not to engage with this. But there's actually often very remarkable sophistication around really making sure that cities and the practices of council are actually welcoming and inclusive, even down to like if there is a Sudanese speaker at an event, they'll make sure to provide Sudanese catering, stuff like that, really kind of trying very hard, I think, in very sort of detailed ways to ensure some degree of cultural, competence and cultural recognition. And so people do, I mean, we did talk to a number of people who felt seen. And obviously it's an ongoing process. Councils don't always get it right. Sometimes people also felt frustrated with their interactions with that. But I think, they've kind of come a long way, particularly in these areas where multiculturalism is kind of an unavoidable fact of life. And we looked at actually one council had recently become a settlement city. So they had not previously had a very multicultural population, then it exploded over the last decade. And they've been doing some remarkable work in terms of catching up. And, many people recognize that fact. So, I do think it matters what councils do. And I do think they've been making a serious effort, at least in these LGAs, and we can learn, other councils in Australia can learn from that.
Okay. Thank you. There's a question here from Lawrence Gray about local government leverage state or federal governments to address the housing needs of the settlement cohort as they have low social capital earning capacity and are working hard to build language skills or stable employment. And it makes a comment that settlement cities are often growth corridors. I think that's probably take that as a comment rather than a question. And we've got Margaret has pointed out that neighbourhood centres often also pick up a lot of assistance to refugees as well. And she declares that she's the chair of the neighbourhood centres of New South Wales. All power to your arm, Margaret, and you're very, very welcome.
Yes, and thank you, Margaret, for mentioning. So this is one of the things that I didn't get to talk about because, I was trying to keep the presentation short. But we do call actually specifically for these LGAs that take a lot of, refugees and high need kind of migrant populations, that they need some extra funding themselves to support that. And one of the examples where they really need it are the neighborhood centers, because you guys, when you're in a highly multicultural area, I'm sure you don't need me to tell you this, but perhaps other people will find it interesting. Neighborhood centers get bombarded with, highly complex, requests from refugees, and they need to kind of bring in interpreters. And there's all this extra work in that they don't get funded for at all at the moment. And it's just, we're kind of shoving a lot of extra work onto them without really supporting them to do it. And I mean, as I understand it, they make a heroic effort to do that work. But I mean, seriously, we need to, we need to make sure that there's some recognition that, if you're going to have refugees settling in an area, that's going to put pressure on certain kinds of local services that those local services don't experience in a place that's not like that. Yeah.
Okay. Oh yeah, have you got a comment to make?
No.
Okay. And thank you for Anne Ricks, who's come in from the New England Family Support Service on Anawan land of Armidale, a humanitarian safe haven city. Anne, you're very welcome. And a question from Rebecca about funding issues, seeing it as a capacity, capital letters issue. She's saying, drawing from my little experience, is that once an organisation proves to have the capacity to deliver, meet mandatory progress reporting and financial acquittal reporting requirements, which can be damned onerous, migrant and ethnic community service providers could reduce the funding issues. Yeah, maybe they could. It'd be good if they did. Certainly reducing the compliance issues, I would suggest, would be something that would be a more user-friendly way to operate. But thanks for your comment, Rebecca. Okay. On that note, okay, is access to English lessons available in these LGAs? Is it available to all refugees on arrival? Aya?
Yes, it is. So yeah, with English skills and language, I like from what we have heard from refugees that there is no issue with this. Usually the issues is with finding work and thinking about the housing issues, as some of the comments also, I think someone raised the issue of the housing. So yeah, for English lessons, they are available.
Okay.
Yes, though it should be said that there's a complicated relationship between having access to English lessons and having an opportunity to properly learn the language. And that requires, of course, being able to practice it. And that's not always easy to get because, again, you're kind of, you need to have opportunities to practice. You need to have opportunities to talk to native speakers. And without employment, that can be quite hard. So there's this. So, one of the things we're starting to talk about now in the sector is this kind of relationship between language learning and employment. And maybe we've got that the wrong way around because, the current idea is you learn the language first and then you get a job. But actually, maybe it's not that clear cut. Maybe those are processes that happen in parallel. We need to kind of figure out how to get people who don't necessarily already have great English into some sort of employment so they have an opportunity to use what they learn in those classes.
Yes, and maybe also I can add here that there is a trust issue that even when some refugees, you see actually that they speak English very well. One of the women that I interviewed, I was able to really understand and interview her without an interpreter. Though, for example, she mentioned that she was refused to be given a job or to work in a restaurant, and the reason for that was because of her English was bad. So imagine here two things, like what kind of English skills do you need to work in a restaurant in the kitchen? This is number one. And then number two, like really to be able to complete an interview with her for this kind of research is more complicated than I think the English skills that you would need to use in the kitchen. But still, usually refugees are really looked at them down in terms of the English language, even if their English is good. So if we want to go into the really complications of this, can be more complicated. But yes, the government, as soon as you arrive here, there are the lessons, but obviously it's a language you need to practice.
Sure.
And to be given the space to express yourself.
Yeah, and I note here in the chat, someone saying that Rebecca, I think, is saying that, or Nola, sorry, saying that there's a lack of funding for interpreter services, certainly for neighbourhood centres and family support services. Very significant funding shortfall for them. That's a fairly significant. And then Ghassan's also come back talking, as he does from his own experience, the different professions in Australia are governed and managed by different professional boards and councils who behave, I guess, in a siloed way, really, without any accountability even from government. And those boards are treating refugees with overseas qualifications with some discrimination. And certainly I know that Ghassan has had a serious experience of that himself. Okay, and then we're just about time to wrap up. Carol says developing language skills on the job can be great, but often the English needed for the job but fall short through the recruitment and the induction process. The volunteer tutor scheme is a great way to practice English. Well, thank you for that, Carol. Aya and Alton, is there anything you'd finally like to add before we move on to Bashar?
I think I have said more than enough. Aya, do you have anything?
I don't have anything.
Okay, well, on behalf of everybody online, thank you both for the presentation this afternoon and for all the work that went into the report. It's a mighty piece of work, and the four of you, Alton Gavranovic, Aya Abu Bashir, Mary Tomsic from ACU, and Mary Vanna. I want to thank you, the four of you, particularly for some really great work. So folks, moving right along, we're very fortunate this afternoon for the next few minutes to be blessed by the presence of Bashar Hanna. Anybody who's involved in the refugee sector over the years knows Bashar Hanna, OAM, Order of Australian Medalist. He's a community fellow at Western Sydney University. He's been involved for, I would say, many, many years with Fairfield Council, and he's a magnificent musician from the Choir of Love and the Peacemakers that he himself also founded. So Bashar, comrade, you're very welcome, and sharing some of your own experience from of these issues. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Phil, and hello, everyone. And honestly, I feel so privileged. Your wonderful introduction of myself makes me feel really humble. I came to Australia in 1998, and since that time, I live in Fairfield, LGA, and I worked most of the 24 years in Fairfield as well. I worked in the settlement program for 3 years, and I established the Arts and Community Development Center in 2014 officially, but I started my first community development project in 2012. This is not the first time that Edmund Rice Center seek my input in their research. And I really value the research because this will document our grassroots experience into papers that people can get benefit out of it. However, we know that everything is changing and life is so dynamic. Like probably refugees, when they used to arrive 20 years ago with their Centrelink benefit, they could do a lot with the money, but now with the life expenses and the increase of everything, they are facing different challenges. That's only one example of the dynamics of this life, how they can change. But however, with my little NGO, the Arts and Community Development, people will say, oh, what's the link between arts and community development? When I studied social science at university, my focus was how to utilize arts to create social change. So what we do is we create artistic activities in order to provide platform to people to feel included. And some people, I was reading the questions and the comments. I totally agree with Mr. Ghassan Shaheen, for example, about the qualification and recognition. So what we do is we do our best to try to cover those gaps by holding events and link people with employers or bring people with successful stories to share their experience that can probably pave a pathway for others to learn. But still, I agree with Ghassan. There's a lot to be done in this regard. Also, a lady spoke about the English classes. Although now the ANEP program extended their hours in Fairfield area, at least that's what I know, unlimited, anybody can. But however, those people with post-traumatic disorder, can they learn English in the classical way? So we are challenging now the andragogy and the pedagogy theories. So we create a program for learning English through songs, for example, Let's program. And that's, if you Google it, you might find some information because the media covered it. As a small NGO, self-funded, sometimes we get little project funded by other organizations. We are trying our best to help refugees. And I appreciate every organization within the research field to study the reality and try to give solutions. Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Thank you, Bashar. You're very, very welcome. And long may you continue to challenge not just pedagogies, but the system. You're a great fighter for justice, and it's a great privilege for us to have you with us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Okay, well, and thank you, Ghassan Shaheen, for your kind words, brother. Thank you very much. Listen, folks, well, that brings us to the conclusion of our formal events this afternoon. There are a few thank yous, of course, that I'll need to make. Firstly, I want to thank Mary Tomsic and Mary Venner, the other two research team members, along with Alton and Aya, for their great work. This project would not have been possible without the work of Farhad Arian, who was worked at the Edmund Rice Centre for a long time and is still with us, although he's not. I know he's on the hookup somewhere here today. But Farhad left beginning of this year, and Alton stepped in and took up the role and has done a great job since then. So Farhad, thank you for your leadership and your wisdom in choosing Alton to take up the management of the program and driving it for the rest of the year. We want to thank the Australian Catholic University for their major contribution in helping us get the research done and in enabling Mary Tomcic and Aya to participate in the project. So thank you, ACU. As I said, there are many other partner organisations, over 18 organisations and 7 councils spread across 4 states of Australia. We want to thank all of them, and they're mentioned by name in the report, but I won't go through them all now. We want to thank the Settlement Council of Australia and the settlement service providers and the refugee community associations. Too many to name individually, but the fact that there are so many and so many participated is a sign of the hope for change we want to see in this country. They're all included in the report. But finally, there's a young man on our hookup today who's taking up the banner of doing this work for the Edmund Rice Centre into the future, and his name is Farid Ghalib. And are you there, Farid, somewhere?
Yes, thank you, Phil. Thank you very much.
So if you want to find any further information about our refugee programs, this is your man. So Farid, just a brief introduction of yourself.
Assalamu alaikum, good afternoon, and namaste, everyone. First of all, as a refugee, I would like to pay my gratitude to the First Nation of this land to allow me to seek protection on their land so I can enjoy my human rights. And I also would like to congratulate Alton and Aya for their great work. And thank you so much, Phil, for your leadership. And thank you, Edmund Rice Centre, for your dedication and working on refugees' rights and advocating for refugees. Yes, I am here. My name is Farid Ghalib. I'm from Afghanistan, and I'm grateful to be part of the Edmund Rice Centre family. Definitely, being a refugee and leaving your homeland and loved one is one of the most difficult experience and decisions someone can make. And moving to a new country can be daunting in different ways, and particularly when someone is fleeing from a war-torn country. So people who are fleeing from a war-torn country, many of them have lost their family members, they are facing trauma, they are facing mental issues. So it's very difficult for them. Not just the physical part of being a refugee is difficult, but then the mental issues which comes with leaving your family and all those wars which impacted everyone is very difficult. So I'm here and I'm very happy to work with everyone who has partnered with Edmund Rice Centre in the past, and I'm looking forward to work collaboratively with everyone. In a time when 1 in 88 people on the earth is forced to flee their homeland, I think it's more important than ever to work for refugees, considering the situation in the world, the catastrophic situation and the war unfolding in different parts of the world, in Afghanistan, in Ukraine, and in many other countries. So I'm happy, and I'm looking forward to work with everyone.
Thank you, Farid. Thank you. Well, on that note, Alton, particularly, I want to thank you. Is there anything you'd like to say in closing?
Well, no, not really. But look, thank you all for, I know many of the project partners and the participants from a refugee background are in the room today. So I just want to thank all of you. We couldn't have done this without you. You were a great part of what made this this report so successful. So thank you very much for giving your time and energy to this. Thanks.
Thank you, Alton. Thank you, Aya. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, ACU. At the Edmund Rice Centre, we have a saying, which is something that is an expression we learned from our old Aboriginal colleagues. Nothing about us without us. Nothing about us without us. And I think the credit I want to pay to the 4 authors here is that they absolutely enabled people from a refugee background to have a say, to be listened to. And in lots of ways, if we could do more of that in this country, we might get the sort of treatment of refugees that all of us are eagerly awaiting that one day will dawn. So look, thank you to all participants. Thank you to our authors, and shukran, and tremendous work. And for those of you in attendance, please, thank you for being here. There is a link on the Edmund Rice Centre's website to the report, and Alton's just posted it in the chat that you can go to straight away if you would like to do that. So to our authors, I lift my glass of water. I say thank you. To all the participants, thank you. And for the refugees who participated and the refugee organisations, thank God you're here. The country needs you, and we really need you now. So thanks, folks. Bye-bye.